today. So I am excited to hear everyone's voices. So thank you all for taking time to join us today. We are incredibly fortunate and pleased to have Dr. Aleah with us this afternoon. As I think most of you know, Dr. Aleah is part of the Rutgers Psychology Department and also the director of the SEL lab there. He has a rich history with CASEL and has been the co-lead of the CASEL leadership team when CASEL was being born, and has also won the award. So we are really fortunate to have Dr. Aleah with us, and I think for those of you who are at the cross-district meeting, we had a pretty lively conversation, I would say, about the interaction between SEL and the student report cards and really how to make that work thing in the district level and for families and students and schools. So the idea of today was to really build on that conversation and, to continue to ask the questions we were asking and get some feedback from someone who's done a lot of thinking in this area, as well as have a dialogue between all of us. So we are excited to get this going. I would say it sounds like most of you are on mute, so thank you for doing that. We also thought it would be good that if you have questions, if you could just chat those into the box, and then I will, if we have a lot, I will do my best to curate those. Otherwise, Dr. Aleah has said he would be happy to respond to those on this webinar, and if there are ones that we don't get to, he has agreed to also follow up by email with folks. So make sure that, some of you have some really important questions, so make sure you ask those and make sure those get answered for you. So I thought it might make sense just to quickly at the beginning sort of let folks say, a couple comments on sort of where you are as a district in this work, whether that is, not even thinking about it, not having started it, or whether you're far along in this road but really want to refine the work or the way that you're using your report cards with your and your SEL work in combination. So I may call on people that I know are on the line and have done some of this work. So it looks like we have some folks from Washoe on the line. So Washoe, I don't know if you want to say one word about sort of where you are and a question you may have in this regard, or you can also feel free to pass. So if you can take yourself off of mute and share.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Very excited about this webinar. Thank you for putting it together, and thank you, Dr. Aleah. We are talking about this. The kindergarten group and pre-K group is more receptive, and I think we all know why, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Great. Thank you, Trish. Did you have any questions you wanted to answer, or you're just ready to listen?
I'm just ready to listen. I'm sure I'll have lots of questions at the end.
Great. Thank you. Sherry and Lindsay and whoever else from Austin, if you mind sharing a little bit about your thoughts here.
Sure. Good morning. Austin has revised the personal development side of their elementary report card about 2 years ago. And so I'm excited to listen and compare the work we've done to Dr. Aleah's work and continue to refine ours. And no questions at the current moment.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. Mary Hurley, do you want to say a couple words?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. This is a very exciting webinar. Oakland switched out the social skills work habits section of the elementary report card last year, and I'll use this verb, dropped in social emotional learning standards, and we're sort of backfilling now in terms of what is the professional learning that best serves teachers and principals in making the best use of social emotional learning standards on a report card, and particularly addressing issues of bias, cultural bias that may emerge. So I think that's the question right now.
Great. Yeah, and that question came from a couple other districts as well, so we shared that with Maurice. Thank you. I think we have someone, Marjorie from DuPage. Did you have anything you wanted to share?
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Hi. Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to join the meeting today. We're in a different situation because we are actually working with 16 different districts. I know that one of them has put something on their report card and, again, struggles with that issue, this issue of it being subjective as far as the teacher's concerned. And we have another district that is in the process of writing assessments, and, you know, in terms of aligning things, their effort to make sure that they have some data to back up what they're doing. They're using the Illinois Learning Standards and writing assessments, and then hope to move that to the report card. But Ruth isn't on the line, and she's our coach, and she has the most insight to what's actually going on today in districts. She's in 2 districts today, so that's why she couldn't join us. But
okay, thank you.
See what we can do to get her to contribute later.
Great. No, appreciate your being here. Thank you. El Paso team, is there anything you'd like to share with us now?
One of the things that's occurring currently in curriculum and instruction with early ed is we're beginning to start looking at how to enhance our elementary report card. So actually this is perfect timing.
Great. I'm so glad to hear it. Is there anyone else that Justina is on the line, I think, from Chicago. Anything to share?
Hi. Yes, I'm on the line. Chicago's been working for a little while to also reflect Illinois State Learning SEL standards in our 1st through 8th grade report cards. So I think we've floated around a couple versions, but are working with teachers and school staff to weigh in on it right now, so nothing's finalized. And we've also sort of experimented with different assessments like SEL. So yeah, and I had actually very similar questions to what Mary raised around cultural bias as well.
Thank you, Justina. Anyone else that wanted to share before we kick off Dr. Elias's portion of the afternoon?
Yes, this is Jan from Anchorage, and I have Beverly and I are here. And we worked with Dr. Aleah several years ago, and we have our kindergarten report card is fully standard-based in all core areas, including SEL. And we have developed K through 8th grade, and there was a change in leadership, and so we are currently only looking or have it changed in kindergarten report cards, but the talk is back on the table to standardize all of our report cards.
Wow, fantastic. Okay. Anyone else that wanted to share before we continue forward? Okay, great. Well, I will turn it over to Dr. Maurice Elias. Thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, this is great. I could have spent the entire webinar time just listening to what everybody is doing. Probably learn a lot. So you hopefully can all see the slides. There is a mistake in the slide because the slide refers to my name as Maurice Elias, but in CASEL land I'm known as Mo. So I'll have to correct that for the future. And my intention today is to share with you more than you need to know. And in that sense, you're not the #1 target audience for the slide deck. The slides are meant to be used by you with folks who have not drunk the Kool-Aid to the extent that you all probably have. Because anytime we want to implement something like a modification to the report card, it's going to clearly involve some very extensive conversations with folks. And so the rationale and the process is really, in our experience, as important as the outcome. So there are some things that you'll see here that I hope will be useful to you, just so that you can understand how we think about it. I'm not going to elaborate on it a great deal. So the first thing we want to establish a case for is that we're not dealing with anything radical, that for many years, teachers have completed report cards on students based in part on data and based in part on observation. And so when we think about SEL and report cards, we're not really thinking about anything different. And what's most important is that we move forward with the idea that this is really a logical and an overdue next step and an attempt to systematize what's already happening to a great deal informally and sometimes even counterproductively, as we will talk about. The other element to this is the idea that we're not dealing with an option, that we know enough to know that the skills that we're talking about are skills that the kids need for life success, and that they have to be in environments that support those skills, and that we have to monitor the efforts of skill development that we're engaging in. And this is an issue of equity and social justice. The reason we say that is because in the current high-stakes academic testing environment, the area that we see very often being given short shrift in the name of academic success is everything but academics. As we will talk about, if we actually want our children to be college, career, community, and life ready, and that's a mantra that we have to repeat over and over again, they're going to need a complete set of life skills. And if we think that we're going to be preparing the kids for their futures without giving them those skills, then we're making a grave ethical and social justice mistake. That's why your questions and thoughts about the issue of bias are so important, because inherently what we're talking about is the beginning of an essential set of conversations. From our framework, it's about social, emotional, and/or character competencies. Again, in the CASEL context, we frame that primarily in terms of SEL. But these essential conversations about priorities are what take us through the issue and question of bias. And one of the things that's very compelling and very important is to recognize that the goal of getting our students into college, both our advantaged and disadvantaged students, is an illusory goal. That now we have to think about college completion plus. And that's where SEL skills become absolutely essential. When the 80% of kids, low income, color, drop out of college, it's not because they're not smart enough. It's because they've lacked the opportunity to build their SEL skills. And those are also the skills that we know are needed for advancement in the job front. So our aspiration to move kids into college admission as the end goal actually contains in it an inherent social justice and equity bias. Because a lot of times, to get kids to that point, we have sacrificed a lot of the so-called non-academic experiences, and it literally compromises their ability to succeed in the future. But at that point, you know, the accountability structure is loosened. We've gotten them to college. What happens after that isn't our concern. But as Savitz, Romer, and Bouffard have pointed out in their really outstanding book, Ready, Willing, and Able, we know better than that. And the preparation for college starts in the K-12 system. It continues into college, but it certainly starts in the K-12 system. And from our perspective, it starts with this set of skills. I don't have to review this for you, but obviously there are many audiences that haven't thought very deeply about these deceptively simple skills and how we're going to capture them. But that's often a longer conversation. People really need to understand at a deep level what these skills mean for academic and life success, as you all do, so I'm not going to dwell on that. The other thing that we have to contend with is the jumbled schoolhouse. So in the vast majority of schools that I've worked in over, 35 years or so, they look like the schoolhouse on top. They've got innumerable number of mandates. They have innumerable number of programs. Every program now is evidence-based. You know this. The phenomenon is something that I liken to Starbucks. And the analogy is just think about this for a second. If you go into Starbucks and you want a small coffee, what do you ask for? Well, as you're thinking about this, you know the answer is not a small coffee, because the smallest coffee you can get is a tall, and then it goes on from there. So in that same way now, every program knocking on the schoolhouse door is an evidence-based program. So now we have to distinguish between evidence-based, super evidence-based, grande evidence-based. You know, it gets a little difficult for the average consumer to know what is evidence-based and what that really means. So we end up with a jumbled and fragmented schoolhouse as more and more efforts get piled onto the schools without them necessarily getting rid of any or modifying them or integrating them. So when we go into schools, we try to focus on what we call the School of Social and Emotional Competence and Character, which is a synergized schoolhouse where it's recognized that academic skills are important, but they rest on a foundation of service and character, that all kids walking into a school, in essence, want to do some good in the world. This is why they walk into the schoolhouse door. They want to be good people. That's possible that there are a few exceptions to that, but you know, I'm not wise enough to know exactly who those are. We actually find out who those are by making the school a really phenomenally supportive and wonderful place, and then we see some kids cannot absorb that. Those are our true special ed kids. But a lot of the other kids that get that label of special education are really kids who are opportunity deprived rather than skills deprived. We also want to make the point that the kids cannot learn when they're hungry or drug involved or scared, or they don't have adequate health preparation, they get involved in premature sexual behavior. All those issues, if not addressed, cave in on academic skills. So we end up with the argument that even if you hated children and only wanted to promote their academic skills, you would have to go down the road of thinking about their social and emotional competence and character and building in them the capacity to serve and to learn in order to serve, and the ability to know what it's like to be a good and valued person. And of course that rests on an ultimate foundation of school, family, community partnerships. But you know, in my own view, it doesn't completely rely on it, but it just certainly rests on that foundation. So because of the jumbled schoolhouse, we need to think a little bit about what's the state of coherence of SEL-related programming in the schools in which we work. That's an important starting point. We want to understand the restraining forces that have kept the current situation in place, and we want to be realistic about the driving forces that might lead to some kind of systems change. Because the report card conversation is deeply embedded in the current situation that you have. And I would say that I will often refer to this as a conversation because it is the conversation instead of conversations that's the ultimate goal. Whether it eventuates in a change in the report card or some other kind of a feedback system, you know, is less critical, but what is critical is having the conversation. And the conversation is in part something that's going to be highly individualized in each school context and will depend on your local driving and restraining forces. As some of you mentioned earlier, changes in leadership make a difference. The connection to certain state mandates makes a difference. And you know, you can't act as if these things exist when they don't in your schools. Here's what I think our big concern is, that we spend a lot of time assessing what ultimately does not matter the most. The standardized tests that our kids take have relatively little instructional value, and they are a cause of tremendous frustration. In the urban districts in which I work, the school is incredibly focused on the tests. Innovation ceases between March and the end of May, and this can't possibly be good for children. So we are dealing with the fact that schools are very often a place where kids are prepared for a life of tests rather than a place where they learn to face and meet the tests of life. This is a very difficult reality. Also, we want to make a distinction between assessment for research evaluation and assessment for improvement. Should schools administer standardized tests in the SECD area, would we want to have an EQ to accompany the child's IQ? This is a debate that's going on in California, at least in California. Angela Duckworth addressed it in her op-ed piece in the New York Times recently. And I think that there are a lot of cogent arguments to be made, but one of the most important to me is the argument from Tony Brick and colleagues in their book, Learning to Improve, How America's Schools Can Get Better, which frankly is one of the most influential books on me in recent memory. Tony says that one must distinguish between assessment for research and evaluation and assessment for improvement. The high-stakes testing is harmful because it uses the rationale for improvement for a process that's really one of evaluation. And creating standardized metrics that are fair, appropriate, developmentally and culturally sensitive, and feasible and scalable has been an elusive task, and it's an elusive task also in the social and emotional domains. The tests that are currently used in most states would not pass many rudimentary rubrics around test construction. The teachers have flawed evaluation metrics under the guise of feedback for improvement. I mean, as you know, the essence of a feedback system for improvement is that it has to deliver timely information. The information from the standardized test that arrives after the children have left the classrooms that they're in is exceedingly difficult to use for, certainly for individual improvement. And so here we know the situation applies to academic tests, and that should lead us to have a lot of skepticism about heading down this road for social, emotional, and character development. So what Brick et al. Recommend, a better way to assess for improvement, is a process by which school professionals in a building or district get together and define the skills and or virtues they believe to be important and the indicators that make the most sense to them in everyday practice. And that, in essence, is the process that we are recommending. And, of course, in that process is it's a built-in way of addressing the issues of bias, because you would not have a rating system that that people would agree upon that would contain those kinds of biases. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So while there's no current system, obviously the report card provides a sort of low-hanging fruit. The report cards often contain a set of academic grades and comments about kids' behavior, character, preparation, motivation, and more. These are elements that right now are organized on our current report cards in a variety of different ways. We actually had some funding from CASEL to study report card comment systems. We summarized that research in the other side of the report card book. And the bottom line is that these comment systems are, and the drop-down menus that drive them, are invariably useless. They're almost impossible to compile for the purposes of program evaluation and synthesis of information about program effects. The feedback is that comes from them is often highly unsystematic. The item wordings are often quite poor and contain sort of multiple indicators within them. Comments are often given without any specific guidelines as to how that can happen and should be done. And by and large, what we're sending out right now to parents is information that is not very useful. And I think that's important to think about, because sometimes we can let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we could be thinking about such, psychometric strictness when we want to think about assessing SEL, when I think we have to think about doing better than we're doing. And of course, progressively doing better, but the next step is to do better and not necessarily to have the psychometric end-all and be-all. So there are several driving forces for using report cards for this, and we've delineated some of them. One of the keys is, frankly, that Common Core state standards and similar standards implicitly require social emotional competencies in order for the kids to learn successfully. There are classroom processes that are built into Common Core pedagogy that if there's no SEL instruction being provided, then it's going to be the lack of SEL that may contribute to the kids not getting the academic concepts versus some issue with their academic understanding. So that's one thing. The teachers are already spending time on report cards. The student behavior is systematically being handled mostly by comment drop-downs. There's a section for comments that people will use or not use. There are district finances already being allocated for production and distribution of report cards, so we're not talking about some kind of a new external system. And some of the more compelling reasons is that parents and students can receive feedback on student progress, focusing on particular skills that are highly valued. That student progress towards skill development can be tracked in a meaningful way on an individual, school, and district level. And the ratings can also be used as early indicators of a student at risk, as well as students who are, if you will, socially emotional assets and resources to their classrooms. We have found this to be true, which is fascinating, how there are just some kids who, along the spectrum of multiple intelligences, interpersonal intelligences are tops, and they become phenomenal resources to their classmates and peers. And finally, that SEL and character ratings are a natural opportunity to have caring conversations around students' positive behaviors. And again, when you think about the fact that for many kids, especially kids in some urban inner city areas, there's a lot of disappointing news gets consistently delivered through their report cards. It's an uplifting thing to have an area where kids can have a stronger locus of control and work to make themselves better people in a way that they might not so easily be able to make themselves into a better math student. So here's another couple of questions that, I'd take a couple of seconds to reflect on them. And so one is, what kind of training would classroom teachers need to measure SEL competencies in an effective manner? This is, I think, one of the questions that you collectively raised in advance. And I know it's been a sort of a vexing question. And we've dealt with this in the districts that we've worked with around this process. And in a sense, here's the answer. What is the role of developmentally informed observation? The act of measuring SEL competencies shouldn't involve great inferences on the part of people. SEL competencies should be visible. And so, for example, I would not be asking the teacher to rate whether a child felt empathic, but I might be asking the teacher to rate or comment on in some way the extent to which a child shows empathy. I mean, that's an important distinction. And throughout, I think we definitely want to avoid any kind of assessment system that asks folks to make inferences at any kind of a deep level. That what we really want is developmentally informed observation. And again, think about professions that rely on observation for assessment and decision making. I will say that we've gotten some real pushback from teachers who've said, well, how am I qualified to observe kids and their social emotional competencies? And, you know, one of my favorite rejoinders is, do you mean to say that you don't feel qualified to comment on whether your students seem to have the ability to join into existing groups effectively, that this is something that is beyond your competence as a teacher to notice and report on reliably? And of course, the answer to that is almost invariably, well, of course we know that. And, you know, then my response is, I rest my case. People are doing this all the time in their classrooms. They're making all kinds of judgments that get folded into their academic grading in non-systematic ways. And what we're really asking to do is to systematize those observations and record them. And that is really something that we feel every teacher should feel qualified to do. The fact that teachers are so reluctant or often so afraid that they won't be able to justify their observations to parents, I believe is a reflection on what's happening more widely in the teacher profession, and the devaluing of teachers, the deprofessionalization of teachers, the demeaning of teachers, to the point where many of them have come to internalize this. So, you know, you talk about issues of equity and social justice. We've got a lot of educators that have internalized oppression from the zeitgeist, if not directly from their own administration. And this is a problem. Teachers really do need to be professionally empowered, much in the same way as doctors do not have a standardized metric for when they poke your stomach and tap your chest and listening to you breathe through the stethoscope. They've got some indicators, they've got some guidelines, they've got some expertise, but, you know, they don't have a detailed protocol. And they seem to have managed okay, and there's even evidence that that experienced, seasoned skill set, it has great diagnostic significance. Okay, so you can digest that a little bit, and let me switch gears for a second and talk about the fact that assessment of SEL is part of a larger conversation of how we bring social emotional competencies and FCC, school culture and climate improvement, into schools in integrated ways. And we've identified from our own experience working with multiple schools over multiple years, 6 what we call leadership tasks. Infrastructure development, in essence, I'll go through each of these, but infrastructure development is the idea that there's going to have to be a group of people that work on this. School identity, clarification, integration, and social marketing is the idea that schools need to do some important prioritization. Climate, culture, and skills assessment, I think links into, especially now with the DSSA, they're going to be increasing mandates potentially for social emotional assessment as well as culture and climate assessment. Promoting student voice, this is something that we've found to be essential for school turnaround processes and other things. Connecting to existing mandates, It's obvious, and then connect to those who are walking the walk. And by that I mean that there's a tremendous amount to be learned from working with colleagues who are trying to do the same thing that you're trying to do, which is obviously this whole network is about that. And we work with school support networks in New Jersey in particular that really live this last function. So let me go into a little bit more detail about these. So ultimately, there's a process of people that need to be created to have a conversation, to lead the conversation about focal SEL skills in your school or district and how staff members see them instantiated. The conversation has to include developmental differences in those observations. How do we adapt them to special needs students? How do we communicate these observations to parents? And how do we connect the observations to methods of improvement? Those are the critical conversations, and there needs to be a group of people who are assigned to lead those conversations, and those conversations will have to be led probably over a period of years. The social school identity marketing essential conversations are, so what does our school stand for? What are our core values and themes? And what skills do we feel is most essential for students to learn to support their success in school and life? Very honestly, in New Jersey, we've gone to an SECD model versus SEL because the themes and values that are articulated about what the school stands for then become very easy to connect with, well, what skills do we need to help our school get there? In other words, it lends itself more easily to a school-wide conversation sometimes than just focusing on what individual skills kids need for success in school and life. We want to have conversations about the extent to which staff, students, parents, and community can articulate these priorities. So it's important that there's a wider conversation about the things that matter the most. And that ultimately, going into some more detail, but that schools' identity symbols are co-created by staff and students. Marvin Berkowitz has a wonderful story he tells about places that put up, schools that put up pre-prepared posters about skills or values, and the implicit idea that they expect that as kids walk by those posters, that somehow those posters in part raise that give the kids the skills, and as they pass by the posters, they emerge highly socially competent. But it's really the act of co-creating and maintaining the identity symbols that builds the commitment to them. And then asking the question, to what extent are we operating in congruence with our core values and focal skills? And that's the sort of obvious point that I know you're all familiar with, and that is that it's not enough to just say it, that we all have to live by it. Administration can't be telling people to be empathic and then not exercise any empathy. That's not a formula for success. The nature of assessment conversations varies depending on where your schools are at. Option one is that you have an existing approach to doing SEL, and now you want to integrate a feedback process. Option number two is where we realize the importance of SEL, and but we haven't gone whole hog into a way of doing it yet. And so we want to start that off with the conversation of what's most important, and then that will lead us into curriculum. Typically, schools are in one of those two places. I did hear implicitly that some of you are aligning to Illinois, for example, Illinois standards. That's an interesting variation. You know, aligning to standards, to external standards for assessment in the absence of conversations about whether the programming you're doing is aligned itself to those assessments can be problematic because the one thing you don't want to do is put into place an assessment system that doesn't align with what you're actually doing. And alignment is really the key. And so, in essence, and I'll also make the case that simplicity is the key. So if the standards are complex, you may be better off focusing on a few of them. I mean, we could probably think of in CASEL 5, each of the CASEL 5 might have 4 or 5 sub-areas, but I would never suggest a school try to assess 20 or 25 SEL competencies. If we really believe that these are interrelated and interdependent, which they are, then I think sampling is going to be crucial, and selecting 5 or 7 areas will cover everything, directly or indirectly, and have the virtue of being feasible. And frankly, you know, from our perspective, certainly all schools don't have to agree on what those would be. The process of arriving at them within a broad parameter of the CASEL 5 should be fine. I don't think any of us has the advanced knowledge to know that these are things that need to happen in only one specific way in order to be useful. I don't want to spend too much time on this at the moment, but we want to articulate clearly how report cards can frankly revolutionize. SEL report cards can revolutionize parent-teacher communication. It can create tremendous alignment opportunities that often don't exist around the Common Core and related standards, which very often are highly complex for parents to support unless they themselves are extremely knowledgeable. So here again we get into this disequity issue. And we want to create opportunities where parents can be true participants and partners with teachers, and that they can do around making their kids better kids. And relatedly, we also want to shift the conversation between students and teachers, because again, a lot of it, in the academic argument, a lot of it comes up to be around deficits, et cetera. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about student voice. I think you can, see that from the PowerPoint, how that's a critical element. Obviously, you want to connect to existing mandates. In New Jersey, for example, we have the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights, which all the schools have to follow, and so, we're connecting to that. But, we'll connect to anything. We're not doctrinaire about this. Whatever we have to connect to, we'll connect to. So I thought we'd take a minute and go through some examples, maybe to make this a little bit more concrete so you can see some of the things that we're doing. And so at this point, I think I'm going to turn over control back to Karen.
So Mary, I've got control now. I'm going to put up the first PDF.
Okay.
Okay, can you see the first one right now?
Yeah. So basically, this first PDF is, it will show you, and again, you'll look at these more at your leisure, but what they do is they outline a process for you to specifically evaluate the current report card comments in your school. And we found that to be a really good starting point because, again, we want to take the position that this is not going to be an add-on. So, we found that that we're proposing that these SEL ratings replace the drop-down comment menus, certainly not act in addition to them. Now, some districts and schools find that SEL doesn't quite capture some of the work habit things that they they want to capture, so sometimes people will retain some of that. But the key thing is it's going to force a conversation of what are the work habits that we really care most about, and how do we want to rate those, as opposed to what happens in the drop-down menu. So again, this is a set of exercises that takes you through a process of looking at what you're currently doing. Next one. Okay, can we zoom in on this at all? Okay. All right, so here is an example of an SEL Likert scale rating that one school has developed, and the issue here is that they've chosen this focal set of skills, and then they've got an agree-disagree rating system. Again, I'm not endorsing these particularly. I'm sharing with you what some folks have developed, just so that you can see a range. To me, I think what's important is the selection of the skills. I do think that there are empirical ways of focusing on whether your rating system is doing what you want it to do. And, you know, we can talk more also about the issue of developmental ratings. If you could scroll to the character system. Okay, so again, just to show you that there are a number of schools that really have more of a character than an SEL focus, and it's possible for them to also develop these kinds of rating systems. And, you know, in some cases, what they consider to be character elements, we might consider to be SEL skills, like paying attention and resisting distractions, right? So they might see that as the character skill of focus, and we might see it as SEL skills. Okay, next one. Okay, so this is a little harder to see, unfortunately, but what it shows you as you look at it, okay, that's good, and we're going to actually eventually take a more expanded look at this, but we wanted you to see that there's a developmental way of looking at SEL skills, and this is not to single out any particular district, but I'm certainly I have seen, and our work has been informed by what Anchorage has done in this regard. And so we think it's very possible to delineate developmental indicators of SEL from K to 12. And this is an example, an excerpt of an example of a district that has in fact done that. What I think is interesting is to take a look at the fact that in grade 3, you can see that self-awareness and self-management skills are defined as taking place with prompting. As you move into other grade levels, you'll see that there is prompting then becomes something that we don't expect. And then we can also, you'll see some variation. For example, you can see for grade 4 emotional awareness, it talks about the fact that kids can recognize and label a range of emotions, et cetera, most of the time. And so again, I think as people step back and think about what they can realistically expect from kids, they can define standards that do not necessarily include perfection, and in some cases, not even the ability to independently exhibit the skill. That it then creates, if you will, a corresponding requirement on the part of the school to provide the prompting necessary for the kids to develop the skill. That adult prompting is seen as part of skill development as opposed to this being seen as some sort of a trait on the part of the child. So we feel that these kinds of developmental standards can also send a powerful message that is, in fact, It's interesting. A lot of folks who are involved in the rating teams end up drawing a lot of insight from their own children who they consider socially, emotionally competent at a given age, but, for example, are not emotionally aware all the time. And I think as we think about this, it's true for all of us. You know, even those of us who are really great at emotion regulation occasionally lose it, and are occasionally losing it does not disqualify us from being seen as a skill. So those are very interesting conversations that I think, again, people would need to have. Next. Can you go to the next one? Great. So I just wanted you to see a well-worked-out example of a character-based assessment. Some of you may be holding your noses as you're looking at this, but this particular school, which is, they call it Montclair Kimberly Academy, but it's really a ninth grade, sort of specialized ninth grade within a public school framework. They feel very strongly about character, and they developed this. They have used it for a number of years. It works for them. May well not work for you, but I'm reasonably certain that some of what we would develop on the SEL side wouldn't work for them. So they use this as part of their application for becoming a national school of character. So I wanted you to see some of that variation, and now maybe we can get back to the PowerPoint. Great.
I'm about to pass control to you.
Okey-doke. Thank you.
And Mo, just so you know, we should probably shift to questions in just a few minutes, but this has been wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to, and again, this is not something that we have to dwell on now, but what I have for you to look at is a definition and developmental differentiation of skills around emotional awareness that one district has shown, and they rate the kids as being either, if you will, at, above, or below grade level. And then they do the same for emotion regulation and focus. Here again, you see the issue of prompting, how consistent are they, and that there's not extraordinary difference between grade 4 and 5, but some. There are some grade levels where in schools we work with, they've said sometimes between second and third grade or first and second grade that they are not making any developmental distinctions, and I can understand that. So one of the things that we've done in training folks on this is to present them with a case example. And so here's a particular student named Aleah, and this describes a little bit about her behavior and goes on, and then folks are asked to go back and decide how they would rate her on emotional awareness and emotion regulation and focus. We found that exercise of doing this on case example has been one of the most significant ways we've moved people into a different view of this. It really helps a lot of people say, oh, is that really what we're dealing with? And that's been a very positive learning tool. So the answer key follows in one of these slides, and I'm going to zoom past it in case I don't want you to see the answer key. So at this point, I've got some questions for you to think about, but you've got questions for me to think about, and that's probably where we should start. So I'm going to shut up and start hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Mo. That was incredibly thought-provoking, certainly for me and for others. At this point, folks can chat in questions or just feel free to type in. Thank you. So I'm seeing a couple of questions here. Are you able to speak to the link between competency-based learning, which will require schools to break down courses into necessary skill components, and what considerations we should take into account when we have course grades that may reflect only strict academic skills or possibly include the non-cognitive skills as well? Thank you.
Well, I think it's going to depend on how politicized these are, because I don't think that it's I don't think it's possible to separate the academic skills from these other skills, because these skills are about kids' ability to learn, function in the classroom. So, you know, the idea that we would somehow develop something that's purely academic would have no scientific support. And that doesn't mean it won't happen. But this is where we get into the politics of education versus the education of children. And so that's a very tricky one. But, you know, in essence, one can try to integrate SEL into every one of those academic questions. But from an efficiency point of view, it might be better to pull SEL out. Now, in the middle and high school, get into the issue of who's going to be the rater. And so we have been advocating for multiple raters. And because each person dealing with a kid has a different perspective, and different schools have to have conversations about who's going to be the rater. We're working with one school, middle school, that has 3 raters. They've got an advisory where they're teaching the SEL skills, and that person gives a rating. They choose an academic subject area, and they get a rating from an academic subject area. And then they also choose a specials class and get a rating from the specials class. And they feel that each of those adds a piece of the puzzle, a set of observations about the kid. Each of those ratings, by the way, again, is only limited to what people see. So if I'm rating the kid in my advisory and I'm hearing that the kid's a pain in the neck in the lunchroom, that doesn't enter into my rating. Because if the kid's not a pain in the neck in the advisory, then, you know, we have to deal with those discrepancies in other ways. But we want people to be focused on the rating situation as a behavior sample. And if we try to integrate the SEL skills into every one of the academic ratings, I fear that if we propose that, it would be impossible.
Thank you. And you actually touched a bit on one of the other questions that has just come in, but is there anything you would add? It seems like a lot of the focus has been on K-5 report cards. Is there anything you would add on sort of what you're seeing that you would recommend at the secondary level? Certainly the multiple raters point is well taken.
I mean, at the secondary level, I think it's complicated, and I think this is a problem with secondary education to begin with. But some of it actually depends on how is SEL instruction being organized at the secondary level. Because that's certainly the first issue, is to make sure that those who have a primary responsibility of instructing in SEL have the opportunity to give feedback on what they're seeing directly from the kids. You know, of course we want generalization, but the first step is, are we seeing it in the place where it's supposed to happen? And then we can go out to look at generalization contexts. So a lot of the decision really does depend on how SEL is being configured. If you're using a curriculum like School Connect in the high school, or Facing History in Ourselves, then how the kids perform in that will be a very critical rating context. And then you would choose some kind of generalization context that made sense based on what you were expecting and what directives you were giving the kids for generalization. So in other words, if I'm teaching Facing History in Ourselves, and I know that curriculum well, where would I expect to see that generalized as a first step? Would I expect to see it generalized in the lunchroom, during recess? I don't think so. But there may be some contexts that I would expect to see it generalized first, and that's where I would concentrate my thinking about the next line of rater.
Thanks so much. And folks, people are sending me questions, and I'm happy to relay them, but you can also just ask them yourself if you get sick of my voice. But we had a great question around, it seems like a lot of the unit of change that you focused on is at the school site. How would you recommend, since many of our folks are at the district level, the systems and structures and PD that can really support developing capacity at different levels?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about it at the school level, but you know, we've been working at the district level as well. That just requires another level of coordination. But in essence, the conversation happens at the school level, and then becomes a shared conversation. So, for example, in one district that we're working in, they have school culture and climate teams that worked on this, and then they have representatives of those teams as part of a district-level team, and that district-level team, with interactive feedback back to their school teams, took a lead role in developing a consensus. And so they, across their 8 elementary schools and 2 middle schools, they have a defined set of skills that they're all focusing on. Started at the school level, and then the conversation moved up, and if you will, up and back down until they came to some kind of consensus. So I may not be addressing directly the response, but I see no impediments at the district level. Obviously, you know, if you're thinking about it at the county level, like DuPage, you know, it's just going to take that much more conversation. And frankly, I'm not sure how much we should expect to see broader agreement on those things. I mean, you know, I don't know that I would want to go past the district level to try to get some kind of a consensus, because districts themselves have enough variability within them. Once you start going across districts, you're also beginning to introduce more variation, and I think that the feeling of ownership of this is really critical.
Interesting. I mean, I think that will provide a challenge for many of us who, you know, districts do have a unified report card, but certainly a point well taken. I think another question that came up is, I find a common language and definitions of vocabulary support or hinder conversations. Can you clarify thoughts on differences in developing character versus social and emotional competencies and skills?
You know, I think that when you're a school that's been steeped in the character, language, and logic, it has a different meaning than it does to me. I mean, I've tried to position myself as an ecumenical crossover person, but I know that some of the folks who take a character perspective see things a little differently than I do. I ultimately think that SEL skills, or that character, has to be linked to how do you enact that character. So at the end of the day, I see some connection between those two areas, and I think that was even implicit in one of the Likert rating example I showed you. But that being said, I think that for the character folks, they are talking about a valence of behavior that is sometimes implicit in SEL, but not explicit. And I think that's an important thing, because one can be a highly planful problem solver, but also up to no good. And I think that this is what is going to be required of our conversations, because implicitly, when we talk about kids who are good problem solvers, we're talking about kids that problem solve for good. But that's not strictly what the skill is about. So I do think that there are character elements that will seep into the SEL conversation, And I think as SEL, as character folks have to operationalize what they're doing for the purposes of conversation with others, they're going to have to concretize it with some skills. So I see a little bit of a, I wouldn't say meeting in the middle, but I would say that there's a positive influence of one on the other.
Thank you. Do you know of research that has examined teachers' ability to rate social emotional competencies in ways that are beyond their global perceptions of kids, especially with respect to a teacher's ability to identify social emotional competencies that may be related but not directly linked to their current academic performance?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, we're in the pioneer stage. So, and of course, this is the challenge. And frankly, this is why it has to be an equity and social justice issue. Because if we're waiting for the research, we will wait forever. The research can only reflect what's happening in widespread practice. The research that will get generated, like the research that uses the class. I mean, the class is not a generalizable system. So there are lots of things we can invent to do observations and systems, but they're not going to be feasible for practice. And I think this is the insight that is from Anthony Brick's book that's so very important, that research gives us a tremendous amount of guidance, but at the end of the day, it doesn't say what's feasible and practical and sustainable. That can only be forged out of systems of practice. So my feeling is that we can wait for the research, but even the best designed developmental research would take years to actualize, and even then we get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 studies if we're lucky, which would be, who knows where they would take place. Would they be generalizable to all our different settings? I doubt it. So there's a reason I think that we talk about theory and research. That they're complementary, but sometimes I think theory needs, research-informed theory has to lead innovations in practice. Then we have to have a commitment, and this is why support networks are so critical. We have to have a commitment to really share and evaluate what's happening in practice. In one of the districts that we're working in, the ratings were implemented and piloted, but not shared with parents because everyone wanted to see what the pattern of ratings were, what they were going to look like, to see if the metrics were adequate. And from that, by the way, came a realization that to use the same metric on special education kids would invariably be to lead them to be getting below grade level on a lot of stuff. And is that the kind of message that we want to communicate to parents routinely? And then that led us to issues in particular schools we were working with that they didn't even have any systematic ways of identifying sort of electronically who their, and flagging who their special education kids were. So, piloting in practice is going to be the key to future success in this. And then once we've got some systems that we really think are good, then we can research them and figure out how to make them better.
Thank you. I have one more here, but does anyone else want to just chime in? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share this one, and then I'll open it up to anyone else, but I think this is one that will be relevant to a few folks. But how does an SEL assessment system such as the DESA fold into this work around report cards?
The DESA? Well, I mean,
yeah, or other similar.
Right. So I mean, the DESA is a really good example. We use the DESA in research, and what we find is that it's useful in the research context, but not in the performance improvement context. And the reason is, and the only reason is, because the DESA may not be aligned with the SEL instruction that a school is doing. So the school needs to have a frontline measure of SEL because the DESA competencies would be a second-line accomplishment. And although the DESA is designed very well, and I think, again, has tremendous value for research, the 4 forms are, maybe equivalent in the sense of leading to 4 total scores that are interchangeable. But when you look at the items on those 4 forms, they're not identical. And so if I'm evaluating my instruction against those items, I'm not going to get the kind of feedback that I really need to help me know what my kids are grasping. And there are developmental issues with regard to the DESA that I think, obviously we have to keep in mind. So this, to me, just gets back to that distinction between evaluation purposes and improvement purposes. For improvement purposes, I think we have to be highly aligned with whatever instructional approaches we're taking to either SEL and or character development.
Great, thank you. I will leave it open for a couple of moments, and then I will let you close it out. Does anyone else have any final questions they want to pose?
Hi, this is Mary from Oakland, and I guess we're also really curious about talking about the conversation around social emotional learning that teachers have with parents using the report card as like the document, and has there been work around how do we help teachers have that the essential conversation with parents?
Well, I think this is a hugely important question. Again, we found that teachers are hesitant to have those conversations. But again, we know how important the social and emotional element of the student's behavior is to the classroom. So again, I think what we're trying to do is to systematize something that is happening or not happening implicitly. And so that means that we're going to hear a lot of teacher discomfort. And so, and I think in the book we address this. We have a bunch of FAQs for teachers because we've heard a lot of the complaints and issues that teachers have. Ultimately, we tell the teachers that this is something new, and we are going to have after parent-teacher conferences, you got to come back, get together, find the questions that were tough to answer, develop your FAQs for those questions, and continue that process. And after about a year, there's a really good chance that you're going to have exhausted most of the things you're going to hear. There are other complexities that come up. What if the kid has a real problem and the teacher says, well, where does my child go for help? Teachers should have the answers to those questions. The issue now is that we're sort of avoiding those conversations. But this process, makes those kinds of issues unavoidable, and then requires the school to think about, well, if our kids are getting SEL instruction and they're not getting it, what do we do? I mean, do we have a Tier 2 coordinated SEL instructional plan? That's an issue that many schools have not thought about or have chosen not to address. But these conversations get you there, not to mention the conversation about what are we doing at Tier 3, and is it coordinated with Tier 1? So, that again, I think is part of the power of these conversations. They're going to take us into some territory where there's going to be a little discomfort, but right now we're avoiding them. And it goes back to me to this being an issue of equity and social justice. For a lot of our well-advantaged kids, if these conversations don't happen in school, they will happen in other places, and they will be okay. But for our disadvantaged kids, particularly kids of color, a lot of our immigrant kids, if these conversations don't happen in school, they're not going to happen anyplace else, and they're going to be tremendously disadvantaged in life. So that's why I feel there's an imperative to go down this road, even though it takes years, a good couple of years to iron things out.
Any other final questions before we close out? Well, I think if we all took our phones off mute, you would hear us giving you a nice, warm round of applause. Incredibly grateful
for your
insights.
I just want. I would just want to close out with a couple of quick things.
Please,
number one, So again, I do want to give you these questions to think about. I mean them seriously. I think this is the only way we ultimately make progress. Know what our takeaways are. Know what our follow-up questions are. I am open to your, your follow-up questions at any point in time. So please don't feel like if you didn't ask it now or think of it now, you can't ask it, because those questions are going to be helpful to everybody. Think about the sequence of what's going to happen. Who else needs to be part of the conversation? Think about the challenges. Think about the strengths. Who's already on the team? Where can I go for help, support, and assistance? And if all this doesn't work for you, I will unleash the solution that we found to ultimately overcome all resistance. Yep, that's the one. We get my grandson after people. And, with the sword and the look and the bandana, he's the enforcer. So he eventually gets people to come in line. We don't try to hold them back until it's really needed, but he's pretty effective. In the absence of that, I just want to say that what you're doing is in the realm of courageous leadership. People are not asking for this. We draw a lot of inspiration from Tim Shriver's dad, Sergeant Shriver, who created Head Start when no one was asking for it, created the Peace Corps when no one was asking for it, created Work Study when people were just getting handouts and wanted handouts, created Vista when people, didn't particularly think there was a great need for domestic volunteering. We can go on and on. But this is courageous leadership because we're trying to put children first, and that's not the paradigm. And I would just say what John Wooden said, which is important, and that is, don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. Every step of progress is critical in potentiating the next step, even if it seems very small. And Ted Sizer talked about, in his wonderful book, Children Are Waiting, and he's made the point that the children are waiting for the adults around them to make them a priority, and they've waited long enough. So not to minimize the difficulty and challenge in this, but you are a tremendous collective, linked to a tremendous collective, and with coordinated action, I think there's really, frankly, no limit to what can be accomplished. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you and learn with you and eventually follow up as your questions emerge.
Thank you so much, Mo. This has been wonderful. I know everyone is thanking you in their various cities across the country, and I'm sure you'll have some folks in touch with you in the future. So.
Okay. Yeah, let people know how they can get in touch with me so that we can follow up.
Will do. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Okay. Take care.